The late afternoon sun bled across the vast Midwestern sky, casting long, mournful shadows over the cornfields that stretched to an endless horizon. From the road, the old farmhouse looked just as Caleb remembered it, a sturdy silhouette against the fading light, framed by the skeletal arms of the apple orchard. But as his truck rumbled down the long gravel driveway, a profound stillness settled over the scene, a silence that felt heavier than peace. It was in the dust coating the porch swing where his mother used to sit, in the unkempt edges of the lawn, and in the cold, vacant stare of the windows. The land itself, once a promise of life and warmth, now seemed to hold a deep, chilling secret. This wasn't the welcoming embrace he had pictured for years. It was a place hollowed out, a home that had lost its heart. Caleb stepped out of the truck, his movements measured and deliberate, the discipline of his military years etched into every line of his body. He was a man built for carrying weight, but the stiffness in his shoulders had less to do with the rucksack he'd left behind and more with the memories he couldn't. His eyes, which had scanned deserts and mountains for threats, now swept over his childhood home, searching for a sign of the one person who represented safety. He had held onto the image of his mother's smile like a compass, the one true north that would guide him back to himself. After all the noise, the chaos and the loss, all he wanted was the quiet comfort of her presence, the simple feeling of being a son again in the only refuge he had ever known. The front door opened before he reached it, but it wasn't his mother's familiar figure that filled the frame. It was his younger brother, Shane, holding a baby bundled in a pale yellow blanket. Beside him stood his wife, Laura, her smile thin and fragile. The air inside the house felt foreign, scrubbed clean of his mother's scent of baked bread and replaced with the sterile smell of baby powder and something else. An undercurrent of tension that made the hair on Caleb's arms stand up. His gaze darted past them into the dim living room, expecting to see her rising from her favorite armchair. But the chair was empty. A growing dread coiled in his stomach as he finally spoke, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the storm brewing within him. "Where's Mom?" Shane shifted the baby in his arms, his eyes avoiding Caleb's direct and piercing stare. "She left," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones. "Decided to go live her own life." The statement was so jarringly out of character, so contrary to the very essence of the woman who had poured her entire being into that land and her family, that it didn't register as truth. It was a lie, and Caleb knew it instantly. He saw it in the way Laura's gaze dropped to the floor, her face a mask of guilt and discomfort. He felt it in the cold, calculated emptiness of his brother's voice. In that single, heart-stopping moment, the soldier in him took over. The homecoming was over. His mission had just changed from finding peace to finding his mother. The truck's engine was a low growl in the quiet street as Caleb pulled away from the farmhouse, Shane's lie hanging in the air like poison. He drove without a destination, the familiar landscape of his youth scrolling past the window, now foreign and hostile. Every cornfield, every weathered barn seemed to mock him, a testament to a life he no longer recognized. He had been trained to identify threats, to analyze terrain, and to act with decisive force. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemy wore his brother's face, and the weapon was a quiet, soul-crushing deception. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, the soldier's discipline warring with the son's raw agony. He needed intelligence, a starting point. His mind settled on Mrs. Gable, his mother's oldest friend, a woman whose honesty was as unshakable as the oak trees in her yard. He found her small, white-paneled house on the edge of town, a beacon of order and care. Roses climbed a neat trellis by the porch, a stark contrast to the creeping neglect he'd just fled. When he knocked, the door opened to reveal a woman whose face, etched with the fine lines of 80 years, registered first shock, then a deep, knowing sorrow. Her eyes, watery and kind, held the truth he was so desperately seeking. Before a single word was spoken, he knew. It's a terrible weight, seeing a story of pain in someone's eyes before they even speak. Sharing these stories is often the only way to feel less alone. And if this matters to you, subscribing helps us ensure these important voices continue to be heard. Mrs. Gable simply stepped aside, her frail hand gesturing for him to come inside, away from the prying eyes of the quiet street. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and chamomile tea. Mrs. Gable sat him down at her small kitchen table and recounted the story in a voice that trembled with indignation. She had seen it all from her window. She described the argument on the porch, Shane's voice sharp and cruel, Margaret's posture shrinking with every word. She saw Shane pack a single-worn suitcase for his own mother, his movements brisk and devoid of any warmth or regret. He had driven her away, not with the care of a son, but with the cold efficiency of an eviction, leaving her on the curb at another friend's house. The details were small but brutal, each one a fresh stab of betrayal that cut Caleb deeper than any wound he had ever sustained in combat, leaving him breathless with a grief he couldn't yet process. As Mrs. Gable spoke, Caleb's mind drifted back through the years, a flood of memories washing over him. He saw his mother's hands, caked with soil from the garden, kneading dough for bread, gently stitching a tear in his childhood jeans. He remembered the smell of the apple orchard in bloom and the sound of her humming as she worked, a constant, comforting presence that anchored his entire world. She was the heart of that farm, the force that made it a home. The thought of those capable, loving hands now idle and trembling in a stranger's house filled him with a profound and searing guilt. He had been fighting for his country, for the idea of home, while the very foundation of his own was being systematically destroyed by his own blood. A familiar rage began to boil in his gut, a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. It was the same controlled fury that had served him well overseas, a tool for survival. His first instinct was to turn his truck around, to drive back to the farm and unleash that force upon his brother. He imagined the confrontation, the satisfaction of seeing fear in Shane's eyes. But then, another image surfaced. His mother's face, her belief in kindness, her quiet strength. Violence would only shatter what little was left. He knew, with a certainty that cooled his anger into a hard, dense resolve, that this was not a war to be won with fists. He had to honor her by fighting with a different kind of strength, a disciplined patience that felt far more difficult than any physical confrontation he had ever faced. His search became a quiet pilgrimage through the small town. He visited old neighbors and distant relatives, his questions measured and calm. The responses he received painted a fractured picture of the community. Some, like Mrs. Gable, offered their stories in hushed, sympathetic tones, their eyes filled with pity for Margaret and a quiet disdain for Shane's actions. They confirmed the timeline, adding small details that solidified the truth. But others were more hesitant. They shifted their weight, their gazes dropping to the floor as they muttered vague pleasantries about not wanting to get involved in family matters. He felt like an outsider, the returning hero now a pariah, disrupting the town's carefully maintained and fragile peace with his inconvenient quest for the truth. He soon learned that Shane was not merely waiting for the issue to fade. He was actively waging a campaign of misinformation. A cousin called Caleb, her voice low and worried, to tell him the story Shane was spreading. He was telling people their mother was becoming forgetful, that she'd had a few close calls with the stove and was a potential danger to his newborn child. He framed his cruelty as a painful but necessary act of love, portraying himself as the responsible son burdened with a difficult decision. It was a masterful, insidious lie, designed to poison the well of community support and isolate Margaret completely, turning her into a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. The calculated nature of the betrayal was what stunned Caleb the most. The combined weight of the lies, the town's apathy, and his own internal demons became almost unbearable. One evening, he parked his truck by the old fishing spot on the river, the water black under a moonless sky, the quiet of the countryside. Once a balm to his soul, now felt oppressive. The chirping of crickets began to sound like the static of a combat radio, the rustle of leaves like footsteps in the sand. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as the familiar dread of a panic attack closed in. He gripped the steering wheel, anchoring himself to the cold plastic, breathing through the wave of terror. His mother had always been his safe harbor, and without her, he was lost in a storm of his own making, his trauma threatening to pull him under for good. It was there, in the suffocating darkness of his truck, that something inside him shifted. The rage was a fire that had burned itself out, leaving behind not ash, but a clear, hard purpose. He realized that fighting Shane was the wrong mission. Avenging his mother's pain would not heal it. The true objective was not to win a battle against his brother, but to restore his mother's dignity and peace. It was a mission of rescue and reconstruction, not of destruction. This is often the hardest part of any journey, the moment you realize the fight isn't with others, but for them. If you believe in that quiet strength, subscribing is a way to help us continue to share these powerful stories of transformation. His focus narrowed, his resolve solidified. He had to find her, not just for her sake, but for his own. With this newfound clarity, Caleb changed his tactics. He stopped visiting people to ask about the fight or to gather evidence against Shane. Instead, he began to ask about his mother. He brought up old memories, shared stories of her legendary apple pies, and asked how her garden had been doing before she left. He was no longer a soldier on reconnaissance, but a son, trying to piece together a portrait of the woman he loved, reminding the community of who she truly was, not the caricature his brother had created. He spoke of her not as a victim, but as the vibrant, resilient woman who had raised 2 sons, managed a farm, and been a cornerstone of their small town for over 40 years. His gentle persistence finally broke through the wall of silence. A woman who ran the local diner, an old friend of Margaret's, called him late one night. She had been afraid to speak up before, torn between her loyalty to Margaret and her fear of Shane's influence in town. But Caleb's quiet, determined love for his mother had moved her. In a hushed voice, she told him everything. Margaret was safe, staying in the spare room of another friend, a widow named Martha, who lived on a quiet street across town. She explained that Margaret was drowning in shame, too heartbroken to reach out and terrified of making the rift between her sons irreparable. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Caleb wrote down the address on the back of a gas station receipt. He sat in his truck for a long time, the engine off, staring at the simple words on the crumpled paper. The address felt like a coordinate, a final objective marker in the most important mission of his life. The anger and confusion had finally burned away, replaced by an overwhelming ache of love and a singular, unwavering purpose. He was no longer a soldier searching for a war, nor a lost son searching for a home. He was a protector, a guardian. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life in the silent night. He was on his way to find the heart of his family and bring her back from the exile she never deserved. The house was a small, tidy box of white siding on a street lined with identical maples, their leaves just beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn. Caleb parked across the street, his engine cutting out with a final sigh, leaving an unnerving silence. For a moment, he just sat there, the crumpled gas station receipt on the passenger seat feeling heavier than any mission briefing he'd ever held. This was the final coordinate, the objective. He walked up the cracked concrete path, his boots feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet afternoon. He didn't knock. Following the faint sound of a trowel scraping against earth, he moved around the side of the house. There, in a small, sun-drenched patch of yard, was his mother. Her back was to him, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, her movements as gentle and familiar as a half-forgotten lullaby. He watched her for a long time, a silent observer of her quiet resilience. She was tending this small, borrowed patch of earth with the same care she had poured into acres of farmland, her hands finding their purpose in the soil. He saw not a frail, defeated woman, but the unwavering fortress she had always been. Its walls breached, but its foundations still strong. He took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of damp dirt and ripe tomatoes, and stepped into the yard. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than he intended, rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Margaret froze, then slowly turned, her eyes clouded with sorrow, widened first with shock, then with a wave of unconditional love that washed over him, closing the distance between them. He walked to her, knelt in the dirt, and simply said, "Mom, I'm home. Let's go to our home." The words broke the dam of her carefully constructed composure. Tears streamed down her face, silent and heavy, soaking the front of her worn cardigan. Her hands, covered in soil, trembled as she reached for him. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice cracking with a pain that went far beyond the loss of a house. "I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid you'd come home and see what I'd let happen. I was so ashamed. I thought I'd lost everything, that I'd lost my family. I was afraid I had lost your love." Her confession was a blade to his heart, revealing that her deepest wound wasn't the betrayal she had suffered, but the fear of having disappointed the son she loved more than life itself, the son she had always tried to protect. In that moment, the soldier in him finally, completely stood down. The discipline, the control, the hardened exterior he had worn for years crumbled away, leaving only the son. He pulled her into an embrace, heedless of the dirt and tears, and held her with a desperate strength. "You could never lose my love," he choked out, his own tears blurring the sight of her silver hair. "I was the one who was lost, Mom. I came home looking for you. You were always my anchor, the only thing that made sense. Without you, and there is no home." He confessed his own brokenness, the panic attacks, the suffocating darkness he'd been fighting alone. He wasn't a hero returning from war. He was just a boy who needed his mother. And in that shared vulnerability, they began to piece each other back together. The sound of a car door slamming down the street shattered the fragile peace of the moment. A few seconds later, Shane appeared at the mouth of the driveway, his face pale and his eyes wide with a frantic energy. He had clearly been searching, following Caleb's trail through the town. He stopped short when he saw them, his mother and brother kneeling in the dirt, clinging to one another. The sight seemed to knock the breath from his lungs, and the carefully constructed wall of arrogance he had built around himself collapsed into dust. All the justifications, all the practiced lies, evaporated. He stood there, exposed and broken, his face crumpling as a sob escaped his throat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I never meant for... I was so angry, so scared. I made a terrible mistake." Margaret did not rush to him. She rose slowly from the dirt, her son Caleb's hand steadying her, and looked at Shane with eyes that held not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but carried the weight of the land itself, firm and unyielding. "I forgive you, Shane," she said, and the words seemed to surprise him with their simplicity. "But forgiveness is a seed, not a tree. It needs time and light and good soil to grow. We will go home now, all of us, and we will see what grows." There was no embrace, no easy absolution. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that the path back would be long and earned. Caleb stood silently beside her, his presence a shield. His gaze on his brother no longer filled with rage, but with a somber expectation. The war between them was over, but the work of peace had only just begun. The return to the farm was a quiet affair, the house feeling less like a home and more like a fragile truce. But slowly, life began to seep back into the silent rooms. Margaret moved through her kitchen, the scent of baking bread gradually pushing out the cold emptiness. Shane and Laura, humbled and remorseful, dedicated themselves to rebuilding the trust they had shattered. Shane worked the land from dawn until dusk, his sweat a silent apology offered to the soil his mother loved. Laura, in turn, became Margaret's shadow, learning the rhythms of the house, her quiet help a constant plea for redemption. Caleb, having found his mission, decided to stay. He poured his soldiers' discipline into the earth, mending fences, pruning the neglected orchard, and finding a sense of purpose in the slow, steady work of restoration. He was no longer fighting a war, he was cultivating a home. Caleb's own healing took root in the familiar soil of the farm. He discovered that the discipline he'd learned in the army could be used to build rather than break. The quiet rhythm of farm life soothed the frantic static in his mind, and the physical labor tired his body in a way that finally allowed his soul to rest. Recognizing the deep wounds he shared with so many others who had returned from conflict, he started a small, informal support group for local veterans. They would meet on the wide front porch on Saturday mornings, surrounded by the peace of the fields, sharing stories over coffee. It wasn't a formal therapy session, but a sanctuary where soldiers could speak their truth without judgment, finding in the shared silence and quiet understanding a path back to themselves. The farm, once his refuge, had become a haven for others. 2 summers later, the farm was alive with the sound of laughter. A family barbecue was in full swing under the shade of the old apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit. Caleb, his face relaxed and his smile easy, tossed a ball with his young nephew, while Shane stood by the grill, the 2 brothers sharing a look of quiet, comfortable camaraderie. From the porch swing, Margaret watched them, her heart full, her gaze serene. The land had been healed, and so had its people. The farmhouse stood not just as a structure of wood and nails, but as a testament to the resilience of love and the enduring power of forgiveness. Seeing a family come back together like this is a quiet miracle, a story that deserves to be told. If you feel the same way, please subscribe, because your support is what allows us to continue sharing these journeys of the heart.